So thank you everyone for joining us for the first in our webinar series for this fall, Understanding Interpreting the AB 705 Adjustment. So today we're going to walk you through how MAP morphed into supporting the AB 705 implementation committee through the Chancellor's office, how we came about with the adjustments that were included in the Chancellor's office memo. We're going to talk about some of the early adopters research around MAP, and then also the national research that supported this work. And we'll just really get into kind of the technical aspects behind that. And we'll have opportunities to chat in the chat box. We'll be monitoring that chat box. But first, I wanted to introduce my co-presenters. First, I'm Mallory Newell, researcher at De Anza College, and I'm part of the Multiple Measures Research Team for the RP group. First, I'll introduce Craig Hayward. If you want to say a quick introduction of yourself, Craig.
Good afternoon, everybody. Nice to see you all here. I'm Craig Hayward. I'm the Dean of Institutional Effectiveness at Bakersfield College and a member of the MMAP Research Team.
And John?
I'm John Hetz, the Senior Director of Data Science for Educational Results Partnership in CalPass Plus.
And then we also are joined by Craig Rutan.
Hi, I'm Craig Rutan, the Secretary for the Academic Senate for California Community Colleges.
Thanks for joining us. And Terrence, I see, is on now.
Hi, this is Terrence Willett, Dean of Research Planning and Institutional Effectiveness at Cabrillo College and RP Group's MAP researcher. Hi, everybody.
Great, thank you. Okay, so we'll go ahead and get started. So the main questions that we're addressing in this webinar are, how did we get here, and where does the guidance and data come from that has been included in the Chancellor's office memo? So hopefully we can answer these two questions for you as we go through this hour. So a background on the Multiple Measures Assessment Project. So for the past 5 years, we're in the 5th year of the project. It has been a collaborative effort between the Chancellor's office, and then originally with, it was independent for its first year, then it was subsumed by the Common Assessment Initiative. And we've always been in partnership with the RP Group and Educational Results Partnership. And at the end of the spring of this past year, before we kind of switched over to support AB 705, we had over 90 colleges that were implementing the multiple measures decision tree. So many of you on the line are probably pilot colleges for multiple measures. We set out to identify and analyze and then validate multiple measures data, and that was all using high school transcript data. We looked at non-cognitive scales, and then we also did a lot of research around self-reported high school transcript data. The focus that we had in MAP was around predicting success in the course, and we used classification regression trees or the decision tree models to do that work. And so we kind of took a very conservative approach where we looked at success in the target level course of 70% or higher. And what we ended up finding is that when we supported the colleges in local replication, so we had all of the code and the analysis available to colleges to run the statewide models locally and test the models. And here you'll see that what you're probably familiar with, having probably implemented MAP in the past, the placement rules for the transfer level courses of English, statistics, and pre-calculus. But one thing we were going to note here is that you're probably familiar with looking at the 11th grade versus 12th grade rule sets. And when we moved into the adjustments, what we found was, and we were looking at this over the course of the multiple measures rule sets, is that there weren't much distinction between the 11th and 12th grade variations. And so moving into supporting AB 705, we really just did away with the segue between the division between the 11th and 12th grade and just combined all of the data and made one set of recommendations, which is much more clear. Craig Hayward, is there anything you wanted to add on that?
Oh, that was great.
Okay. So what we found is that when you compare historical placements of colleges before they started using MAP, is that placement into college level courses was pretty small in English and much smaller in math. And when colleges started using multiple measures or the decision trees, they doubled and sometimes tripled the amount of students that were eligible for college level courses. And what we set out to do with the 70% success rate is we really wanted to make sure that there was more access to the courses, but that success rates remained the same. And that's what we really found. So these are early adopters. These colleges were included in the recent PPIC study, or the PPIC study that came out about a week ago or 2 weeks ago now. And you'll see the variations in the colleges by transfer level English and math. But one thing that we found is that overall success rates remain rather stable compared to prior measures, and that's what we had intended the outcome to be. So if we look at an early adopter, Las Positas College, we see here that for Las Positas, they used a slightly lower cutoff, so a 2.5 instead of a 2.6, and this was all self-reported high school GPA, so nothing was official transcripts, all student self-report. And they found that in fall 2015, they had 35% of their students were eligible for transfer level English. And in the year they implemented multiple measures, they had 78% eligible for English. So a huge increase in students that were eligible to enroll. And then they saw actually their success rate going up slightly. And so they went from an average of around 73%, 74%, up to 76 and 77% in the 2 years that, 77% in the year that they implemented it. So success rates really holding stable, so many more students being eligible to enroll in the transfer level courses. And I'm going to turn it over to Craig Hayward to talk about some of the new research out of the PPIC study.
Right, you may have... Yep, thanks. And Mallory, so you may have read the August 2018 PPIC study. There's a bit.ly link at the bottom of the slide, and it's well worth a read. We've excerpted some of the analysis here to complement our internal analysis of the impacts of remedial and developmental reform across California. And if you look at this slide, you can see a relatively stable history of the proportion of students first-time students beginning at transfer level math and English. And if we look at 14-15 as sort of a baseline year, and then as the developmental reforms kick in, including multiple measures assessment and placement as one of those major initiatives, you can see that the proportion of students starting directly in transfer level work has increased. So that's about a 17% increase from 14-15 to 16-17 in the proportion of students placing into math, and about a 22% increase for students starting directly in transfer level English. Next slide, or I guess, Mallory, can you advance the slide?
That's me, yep, next one.
Yeah, and so one more slide from the PPIC study. This one shows the relationship between the percentage of students that are placing directly in transfer level math, so that's along the x-axis, and as the percentage of students who begin directly in transfer level math increases, we also see the proportion of 1 year throughput increasing. So the percentage of students who complete transfer level math within 1 year increasing. And this is actually a very strong linear association that's depicted in this graph. It's about an R of 0.8, a correlation coefficient of 0.8 with 1 being the maximum. So that's a very strong association. We see a similar association in English. The correlation's a little bit weaker there. It's an R of 0.51. Still quite clear association between the reform work that place more students directly into transfer level work, and the ability to move more students to and through transfer level completion. All right, that's it.
Thanks, Craig. Okay, and then John, I'll give you, I think this one's your only slide, so I'll keep clicker for now.
All right. So one of the things that comes up, people ask a lot of questions about why we've moved towards a different method of assessment. And we've talked a lot about this, so many of you on the webinar are already familiar with this, but it's always worth going over it a little bit more. And we're going to talk a little bit more about some of the other elements of the law. But one of the new elements that AB 705 brings in is this requirement that some method of using students' achievement in high school is incorporated meaningfully in assessment. So that can be overall high school GPA, that can be high school coursework, which courses you've taken, how far you've gotten in a discipline, your grades in those particular courses. It provides some options if official grades or transcripts aren't easily available to the college, so you can use self-reported grades or guided self-placement. But it's worth reminding everyone why the use of high school grades is required, and that is because every place anyone looks, they are the strongest, most reliable predictor of college performance again and again and again, including in students' first courses in English and math. And so when you look across a variety of studies, both in California and throughout the country, what you see very reliably is students' performance in high school, how they did day after day, week after week, semester after semester in high school, predicts someplace between 5 to 20 times the variance that an assessment test does when they're coming in the front door. And so it's worth kind of reiterating why we're moving to this alternative method of understanding students' capacity. And one of the reasons is we have a far better predictor of how students are going to do in our courses.
Okay, and then Craig Rutan.
So this work actually started several years ago with the STEPS project. That was the Student Transcript Enhanced Placement Study. So this didn't just start with the Common Assessment. It actually predates MMAP. There was a study that was done for 14 colleges, MMAP beginning in 2014-15 at about the same time that the Common Assessment Initiative began. And so the Common Assessment Initiative work, the grant was approved in 2013. It started its work in 2014 and MMAP became part of the work of Common Assessment with the goal of having a separate assessment system from assessment tests. So it was always intended with MMAP that they would be used together and you would choose the higher placement either from the test or from the MMAP rules. In October 2017, when the legislature passed AB 705 and it was signed by the governor, assessment tests basically went out the window, and AB 705 required us to put together an implementation advisory committee. There are two. There is one specifically related to English and math, and there is a subgroup for ESL because the rules being developed for ESL are different than the rules that the law set out for math and English. And so at this point, RP did some work that the advisory group has looked at. That is the information that went out in the memo in early July, the joint memo from Laura Hope and John Stanskis from the Chancellor's Office and the Academic Senate, giving the placement recommendations for English, the statistics and liberal arts pathway for mathematics, and the business and STEM pathway for mathematics as well.
So that brings us up to speed to pretty much where we are today. And the subject of our webinar this afternoon, which is adapting the MAP rules to AB 705 and making appropriate adjustments to the work and the projected probability of success of students who will place directly into transfer level work. So as we mentioned in the beginning of the webinar, the kind of MAP classic rule set, as we refer to it sometimes, was structured around identifying students who are highly likely to be successful in transfer level work, a 70% probability of success or greater. Now there's been a paradigm shift with AB 705 as of October 2017, and we've had to kind of rethink how we can apply this information and this data to the objectives that are required by AB 705, which is that we maximize the probability of successful completion of transfer level coursework within 1 year. We are also required to only be able to assign students who are highly unlikely to be successful in the transfer level work. Only those students can be assigned to developmental work, which really technically isn't a new requirement, but definitely AB 705 reiterates that loud and clear. So basically, we've put this top tier of high school performance students, high school performance students, strong GPA students into transfer level math directly under MAP Classic. We have 90 colleges at least that are already doing that or some variant of that. What about all the other students? And so the thought process and the logic is, can we identify students whose throughput is increased when we place those students into developmental work? So we want to kind of think about, so first of all, there's this term throughput that comes to the fore that's very key. That's the proportion of students who begin the sequence, who successfully complete the sequence within a specified period of time. And for AB 705, that's 1 year. So we started off by looking at the students who are least likely to succeed based on their high school performance. And we can identify those students in the pre-existing work that MAP had already done with our decision trees. So here's our English decision tree to place students directly into transfer level English under MAP Classic. Would have required that they have a 70% probability of success or greater. And those are the two groups identified on the right of this tree. And I think there's an animation on this slide. If we click, the lowest node group will be identified, and that's the group with a 0.43 probability of success. So only 43% of students with a high school GPA, cumulative GPA less than 1.9 were successful when they started directly in transfer level work. So that's how we read the tree. We start by looking at that group and we say, well, do students with less than a 1.9, when we place them, say, one level below, which would give them time to make it to and through transfer level work within 1 year, do they have a higher throughput rate than, this is the bar here, 43%? Are more than 43% of those students able to make it to and through? If so, then placing them into developmental would maximize their throughput and be in compliance with AB 705. So let's move on. We got a couple of other examples. We'll just click through quickly. Here's the statistics decision tree. We focused on, if you click one more time, this group over here on the far left, so students with less than a 2.3 cumulative GPA in high school. Can those students, when we place them one level below, do they demonstrate greater than a 40% throughput rate? And we have one more tree that we applied, and this is the pre-calculus tree. Or the most stringent tree. This is for your STEM, business STEM students, and if they had less than a 2.6 GPA in high school and they had not taken pre-calculus and they enrolled directly in pre-calculus, only 38% of those students were successful. So can we demonstrate greater than a 38% throughput rate? So that was the original logic, and let's move on here. So here again, this is really the logic just kind of laid out for you in words. So we're comparing the success rate of similar students based on their high school GPA performance. In this case, we started with the lowest node group. Eventually, we expanded that and looked at all of the nodes, and we have the kind of the 3 general performance bands. And then we look at the students who start one level below, and we make that comparison. Okay, next slide. So quickly, the AB 705 implementation committee, had some questions. People in the field had some questions. The questions boiled down to an issue of selection bias. And so the concern is that when we look at the lowest node, the lowest performing students who place directly into transfer level work, that there's an additional filter on that group. In other words, they had to have placed into that transfer level work. And so maybe they aren't fully representative of all of the students for instance, with less than a 1.9 GPA. Maybe they're somehow different than the general population of students with less than a 1.9 GPA. So this was a serious concern that MAP took very seriously, and we engaged with it, and we found that we have some data at our disposal in terms of AccuPlacer scores, and again, the GPA difference between students who place directly into transfer level and students who place one level below, that we can leverage that data to create a statistical model that adjusts for that selection bias. And then Terrence, since you're on the line, I'm going to pass the talking stick over to you, and you can take us through the next few slides on that.
Okay, sounds good. So on the next slide, then we're talking about how we adjusted the rates here, and that would be and so we're taking a look at the GPA and the placement test scores in particular, and using those as primary predictors of success in the transfer level target. And we can hit the next slide. And so we went ahead and used regular multivariate regression in this case, and to be able to come up with some parameters that then we could utilize to do some testing of different scenarios. And we calculated the mean high school GPA and test scores for the lowest node students in each level of their first attempted course. And it turned out there was some associations that became germane between how high had you placed in your college coursework and your high school GPA and the test scores, with you having a gradient in both cases and a bit stronger on the math side than the English side. So we used the regression model to predict success, to create a model based on high school GPA and test scores, available test scores, and then did success rate estimates by taking the mean GPA and test scores from each level, plugging those back into the equation to create these estimates, and then to have equal footing on comparing the regression adjusted predicted success rates to the previously created decision tree success rates. We did a little rescaling. They were pretty close, but we did some rescaling just to make sure that they were comparable, so that we could apply the findings back to the original decision tree rules, and then did a weighting by size because you had different volumes of students in each of the levels below. So when we're looking at the idea of potentially moving students up from lower levels all into transfer level, there's a lot of those students who historically are one level below, two levels below, and relatively fewer who are 3 and 4 levels below. So weighting by volume meant that those students who had historically been placed much lower also contributed less weight to the final predicted success, because we're essentially doing a simulation of, what if we put all these students into transfer level, what do we think would happen with success rates based on what we know from their high school GPA and the test scores, and then including a standard error in there because it's more than just a point estimate, you have a little bit of a range. And so if we go to the next slide, you can see the model itself for English and statistics and pre-calculus for the target courses that we're testing. And for English, we had the high school GPA, and then from AccuPlacer, the sentence skills and the reading comprehension. And then for statistics and pre-calc, we actually wound up using just the college algebra score because the arithmetic and elementary algebra scores really didn't do anything useful for us and just muddied the waters a bit. So, and then we're putting out a technical white paper that's got a lot more detail and the code, so that if you want to get into that level of nitty gritty that'll all be there, and then we'll be available to answer follow-up questions as well. So that is the long and the short of that. We do have coming up in a couple of slides, we're going to show you the results of that regression analysis. But first, what are we comparing it to? So we're comparing this adjusted transfer level success rate, if under the scenario of putting all these people into transfer level, and we're comparing that to the throughput rate from one level below transfer, and we did some adjustments. So I'm going to hand it back to Craig, if that's okay with you, Craig, to hit the next two slides, and then we got the bar chart.
Sounds good. So real quick on the statistics adjustment, when we began to work through the problem of calculating throughput from one level below, we realized that, you can't just look at students who successfully progress and attempt a transfer level math, because that's already a self-selected group of students. So what about the students who intended to progress but weren't able to progress, either because they were unsuccessful at the one level below, or because there was attrition out of the sequence? So that puts us into the kind of space of needing to infer student intent. So we did a couple of things around that. The first was to look at ed goal, and we basically broke apart the throughput rate into the numerator, which would be all students from one level below who successfully completed a transfer level math class. We just kept all of those successes in the numerator, so that we didn't mess with that. But for the denominator, we reduced it because we're going to say some students didn't intend to attempt transfer level math. And so when we looked at the ed goal distribution, we saw that about 11.6% of the students had an ed goal that would not involve transfer level math. We therefore reduced the denominator by 11.6%. And then we also made a decision about the kind of two pathways. So that's why we have two sets of default decision rules for math, and one being SLAM, as we call it, the acronym standing for Statistics, Liberal Arts, Math, and the other being BSTEM, for Business and Science, Technology, Engineering, Math, right? Because with many business programs, you have a calculus requirement. So that's how they're split. And then when we look at the split in the data set of students who do progress, they split in a 75-25 ratio. So about 75% of the students are going into the statistics, liberal arts, math. About 25% are definitely going into a STEM class, which would be pre-calculus trigonometry. College algebra is a default class, so that was not considered to be one that you could definitively tell student intention from. So the 75-25 split is also confirmed by national work by the National Center for Education Sciences, which shows that about 20% of national community college students have a STEM program of study intent. So we further reduce the denominator by 25% because we assume that some of these students are actually intending to go into the STEM pathway. So that's why we say it's sort of we don't want to underestimate the throughput. It may be a bit of an optimistic estimate of the throughput for the reasons that I've articulated and you can see on your screen. We've got some great questions coming up in the chat around some of these points about different curricular entry points. And if we have some time at the end, we can do a little Q&A around that. And if not, then we'll write something up to address those points and respond to those as best we can. And so that's statistics. We have a similar adjustment going on for pre-calculus entry-level BSTEM. And so, again, I guess it's very similar. I don't think I'll go over all of the details. We adjust out for the ed goal, as with stats. The reduction to the denominator here is a 75% further reduction because most of the students' programs of study can be fulfilled through a SLAM math. And then we look at any success at transfer level math again. So this is, again, an effort to avoid underestimating throughput from one level below. And this is what we end up with. Terrence, you want to take us through it?
So here we are with the bar chart, everyone's favorite. And the blue bar represents the lowest node success rate that came out of the decision trees in the original MAP research. And the blue bars with the red error bar, the green bars with the red error bar indicates the expected success rate given the regression adjustments. And so this is doing that simulation. What if we took everyone who had historically, of these low GPA students, everyone who had historically been placed into below transfer level courses, and what if we put them all into transfer level? What would happen to the success rates? Now, for all three target courses, the success rates on average, we expect would experience a decline, so that you are bringing in students who have additional challenges, and so it does lower the probability of expected success. Much more so for math than English. To English, we had to go out to the 10th place so that you could see the difference. So not really much of any difference on the college composition side, and more so on statistics and pre-calculus. And then the orange bar is our comparison benchmark. What is the expected throughput rate of these students if they started one level below? If we gave them one semester or quarter of remediation before going into transfer level, taking into account transfer intent and egg goal, and also the attrition factor associated with moving from one level to another. And you can see that the orange bars across the board are lower than the green bars, indicating that the throughput rate for students, even for these most challenged students with the low GPA performance in high school, that their throughput rate would be higher if we just put them directly into transfer level without any supports, as compared to the traditional approach of putting them in a one semester course prior to getting into transfer level. And a lot of that has to do with the attrition effect of every time we add an extra layer or course or bit of time, it creates another opportunity for students to drop out. And however, I should also note that those success rates are not awesome. I mean, these are students who historically have challenges academically, so you wouldn't expect them to suddenly have stellar success rates. But you look at success rates of 28, 29%, even 43%, that's not something that we necessarily need to be happy with. And that's where the idea of providing concurrent support, either in terms of corequisites, tutoring, supplemental instruction, workshops, etc. And this could also include financial supports and other supports to help you keep your life circumstances together. But providing those additional supports is expected to increase these success rates beyond that level. But the bottom line of this is that to the best of our knowledge, with the data that we had available, it really appears that that maximizing probability of transfer level throughput in these key gateway classes comes from direct placement into transfer level, and then of course encouraging the support. Any other comments or points on this one? Okay, I think that's pretty good then, at which I guess I already led with the headline there on this next slide. And so here, again, just to reiterate, there's a lot of structures for supports that are out there that we can take a look at as well. And the California Acceleration Project is one of several groups that has examples that one can look at for the types of support that people are doing. And the PPIC report is another good resource. So it's a really good time to communicate with your instructional and student services colleagues to help design the supports. So then we get into these placement recommendations. And Craig, did you have some thoughts on these particular slides, or should I keep going?
I think we're going to hand the talking stick over to Mallory at this point.
Sounds good.
Perfect. Yeah. So these are what came out of the research that we just were explaining to you, and that were adopted by the Chancellor's office. So if we look first at English, you can see that students above a 2.6 directly into transfer level English, and there is no change in level of support or concurrent support required for that group. And then the mid-range or range 2 of the GPA, the 1.9 to 2.6, also in a transfer level, but the concurrent or academic support is recommended. And then your lowest level high school performers below 1.9, also in transfer level composition, but additional academic and concurrent support is strongly recommended. And we'll get into questions around can you require co-requisite support in just a minute. So going through again, the statistics, same thing, all students placed in the transfer level statistics, but with varying levels of support based on their GPA, the highest level being 3.0 or higher, straight into statistics, or a 2.3 and a C or better in pre-calculus. And then we have our B-STEM math pathway, which is you're all into your gateway STEM math transfer level course with varying levels of academic and concurrent support, and your highest level greater than a 3.4 or a high school GPA of 2.6 and enrolled in high school calculus. So as we're going to segue now into some common questions and some answers. And I know that John has been monitoring the chat box very thoroughly. Any questions that he doesn't address now that he's going to be presenting here, we'll get to at the end. So we will, I'll turn it over to John.
Okay. All right, so common questions and some answers. We'll do our best to answer as many of the common questions as we can. Some of these things are addressed in the FAQ, and it's just worth kind of going over some of them, and some of them are related to some of the questions we've had. Mallory, do you want to give me the remote, or do you want to run it for me? Okay.
You have it now. Thanks.
All right, excellent. Thank you. So the first one that everyone asks, and we've got some things that hinted around that, is can we continue to place students one or more levels below transfer level? It's possible, but you'll need to do so under very limited conditions. So first, you're going to have an evidence base that uses high school achievement to understand students' likelihood of completing the transfer level course and courses below transfer level. And you're going to have to demonstrate that they're highly unlikely to successfully complete that transfer level course. So that's the first bar. You can only assign students below transfer level if they're highly unlikely to successfully complete the transfer level course. And there's a variety of different interpretations that we've been talking about over the past 6 months. There's some basic plain meaning interpretations. When you ask people what highly unlikely is, most people come in around 10%, both if you ask people in the California community colleges, if you ask the general public, if you go and look at people who've asked folks that use this probabilistic language or estimative probability professionally, they arrive at the same thing. Everyone arrives somewhere between 5 to 10%, and even the highest individual estimates aren't anywhere over 20 to 30%. The guidance from the Chancellor's office right now is defaulting to synonymous with the maximization of likelihood. So let's talk about that other rule that you have to meet, and that is if you're going to place them below transfer level, you have to be able to demonstrate that they are going to be more likely to complete the transfer level course compared to students with the same levels of high school performance. So you can't say these students are more likely than students that we've had before. You have to look within the level of performance. So that's one of the reasons you need to have that high school information involved in this process, because that's going to be an important part of your evidence base. And we've looked pretty hard at that. We've looked across a lot of colleges. Various other colleges have looked at this. It's very hard to meet these rules. So the law allows for it, but there's going to be a high bar of evidence that you're going to have to provide to be able to do so. Can we continue to offer courses one or more levels below? Yes. Such courses may serve specific subsets of a college's student population. There may also be some students that might self-select into that pathway. However, based on what we just said, it's very likely that you're not going to be able to require students to do that, at least not very many. And it's worth some really careful consideration whether you want to offer paths that might attract certain types of students when we have evidence that that path may not actually be best for them. And so there's a couple of different ways, I talk about this, other people use other metaphors. I just did some construction on my house in the past couple of years in which we have kind of a raised platform, and we removed one of the porches. And so to get to the backyard, it was still faster to go out the back door, but it would be about a 3-foot drop. So if people were being thoughtful and they knew what was up, they could get out that way, no problem, get to the backyard. But it's also the case that a lot of people might go out without looking very carefully or not knowing that that construction was under place and fall. So we zip tied those doors closed to make sure that no one would do that. Similar, I've had small children in my house, and we would run into problems every Halloween where if we left the candy bowl out, even though they understood they weren't supposed to eat the candy and that we totally agreed on this, that eventually if the candy bowl was out, they would find it some weak moment and eat more than they should and get sick. And so for us, what we realized is as much as we could kind of talk to them and reason with them about the appropriateness of their behavior, we also, as the adults, knew that we needed to just do a better job of keeping things that would harm them away from them. And so, we didn't take the candy away. We just put it in a place where it wasn't out anymore. And so that dramatically reduced the likelihood of them taking a bad path. Next slide. Do we have 2 years starting in fall 2019 to study our current placement or our current sequence or our current curriculum to determine whether or not it complies with AB 705? This comes up a lot. You do not. There is a large amount of data that exists on your existing curriculum that can be used to determine whether or not your current placement sequence might comply. So you don't have 2 years. If you really believe that your current curriculum can be more, that students at the lowest level of performance, at high school performance, right, those least likely to succeed, can be more likely to successfully complete a transfer level course in your current curriculum than if they start at transfer level, then you should be able to demonstrate that. And so your local data IR team, can do some of that work. We can provide retrospective data sets to them and you to help work on that. Craig and Terrence have been really very good about providing all kinds of resources for working with these retrospective data sets. And so the ability to know this right now is something that exists. You don't get 2 years to study what you're doing right now. You can do that now. You have 2 years if you introduce new curriculum and have some reasonable expectation that that curriculum will be more successful than your current curriculum. Can we adopt new placement rules and prerequisites and study them for 2 years? Sure, but you're going to have to meet all the criteria that we've talked about. You have to have, if you're going to adopt new placement rules, you have to have an evidence base for that uses high school achievement data. You can only place students in pre-transfer level prerequisites if you can demonstrate that they're highly unlikely to succeed in a transfer level course. And you've got to be able to provide supportive evidence that suggests that this new pre-transfer level course that you've developed is going to have higher success rates and persistence rates sufficient to maximize those students' likelihood of completing the transfer level course. So that it's totally possible and plausible. And if you have that type of curriculum, the whole state is going to be eager to hear about it. But you're going to need to be able to you're going to need to show your work. Local placement rules in the transfer level courses with varying required or recommended supports would be easier, right? As long as the students are getting into a transfer level course, then you have a little bit more flexibility. And then there'll be some more specific guidance on how best to do this. We're working on it right now. We should have something for everyone in about a month, but most of the pieces are already there. Do we just have to meet the minimum successful completion rate from the guidance when students are placed directly in the, sorry, there's a something happen with that directly in transfer level for a new sequence to be acceptable. Not exactly. So that's something that people kind of bump up against a lot. You must meet that rate specifically amongst students that are highly unlikely to succeed, right? So for the students who have the lowest performance in high school, so students, for example, who are below a 1.9 cumulative high school GPA in English, right? You have to meet that minimum rate for those students, right? You can't use the overall success rates for your sequence. You can't use the throughput rates for your sequence. You have to be able to demonstrate it for the students who are the least likely to perform well. Can we use a standardized test as part of our placement method? Right now, barring action from the Board of Governors, the information we keep getting from the Chancellor's office is no. The Board of Governors now controls whether or not assessment tests are can be used, which assessment tests can be used. And it looks like right now the Board of Governors is not in the frame of mind to approve new tests. This is one of the things that the folks on the MAP team have talked about a lot. We always feel that we want to use the most possible information to place students, but currently it's looking like going forward as of fall 2019, we're not going to be able to use assessment tests. Can we require corequisite courses? This comes up a lot. It comes up with some kind of questions about the law. Yes, so the AB 705 legislation expressly allows college to require concurrent support. And as a law, it supersedes existing regulation like Title V whenever they're in conflict, and the Chancellor's office and the academic senate are working together to kind of make sure that we're going to iron out any inconsistencies within them. Generally, you should be able to demonstrate the likelihood that required concurrent support will improve student outcomes. That's really not that hard. There's plenty of evidence out there for the effectiveness of corequisite supports. Both CAP has it, there's national examples. So that's a relatively easy bar to clear. And you just have to be careful about the amount of additional concurrent support you're requiring. So if you're requiring 9 units of support on a 4-unit course, that's actually a really significant problem and will make it very difficult for students to be able to complete and will interfere with financial aid. So you have to watch out for those things. One of the things that comes up sometimes is people go, well, the language said recommended. That is recommended for the colleges, not for the students. So based on the research that we know, what we're recommending is that students receive support if they're in that middle band, and that we strongly recommend that they receive support in that in the lowest band of performance. But we're leaving that to the discretion of the colleges, whether or not they want to require support, make it optional, what types of support. So these are recommendations to the colleges, but the colleges are allowed to require it.
What data is needed to support required support in transfer level courses?
The primary amount of the data that you're going to need is something, if you're departing from the general placement recommendations, right? So the 3 bands, and you're going to require students who are above 2.6, for example, in English, you're going to need to provide some evidence that those students weren't highly likely to succeed. But other than that, you have a lot of flexibility in terms of the evidence that you don't have to provide a lot of data because we have evidence for the effectiveness of corequisite support. It'll just be about having an understanding of not the bigger problem is you're going to have to demonstrate if you're using an outsized number of units or you're requiring a prerequisite. In terms of corequisite support, the data requirements are going to be far lesser because we have a greater evidence base for it, the effectiveness of that approach.
Great, thanks, John. Okay, and then another one we didn't address is, can a standardized test be used to discriminate between transfer levels post-initial placement for students that want to prerequisite challenge their ability to succeed at an even higher level than the default rule? So
right now, yes. As of fall 2019, that's not clear to me. My understanding is that the standardized tests are not currently projected to be approved by the Board of Governors. It seems to me that there shouldn't be any reason that shouldn't be allowed to move students more quickly. That makes perfect sense to me, to get them in the right courses where they're likely to succeed. I think that's something that we're going to have to work out as a field, and probably need to be covered in, the next iteration of the frequently asked questions. But right now, it looks like after fall 2019, no.
So a related question that came up to this last point from Mansour, F. Salazar 6 wanted to know about the starting point. For instance, for B-STEM, it just sort of clears students to take, a course in the B-STEM pathway. And so there may be multiple options, even at the initial transfer level. So there is college discretion on that. I guess that you would want to ask yourself whether that's something that the college needed to guide the student to. And in some cases that would be yes, and in some cases it might be okay, or preferable to have the student choose which pathway they were starting down. If you're getting your guided pathways work going, and you're able to analyze the student's program of study and determine the appropriate math. So you have a business administration student, and you want to direct them into the business calc rather than the pre-calc calc, that kind of a thing. Certainly, I think that's all good, all to the good. And AB 705 is more concerned about getting students access to that transfer level that is required for transfer. And then the colleges have local control over that. That's sort of that last mile of the specific course and pathway. Got a new one from Eric Martinson. I've heard discussion of a co-req requirement for students who are repeating the transfer level course. Would that be allowed? So this is a student who directly enrolled in transfer level. I'm just checking with you, Eric, and was unsuccessful in their initial attempt, and then in a subsequent enrollment would then be required to take the co-requisite. So I'm curious if Craig Rattan, if you have an opinion on that, if you've heard that, because I feel like we're getting into sort of curricular uncharted waters.
It seems that it would be possible from the local, it would be a local decision, but it would be allowable under the law. One of the challenges that we have, because the colleges have been asking about this, is it is not clear whether or not the college's SIS systems are capable of putting the enrollment restriction on something like that after a single enrollment, when it's typically set after 2 enrollments before a student has to meet with someone before they can enroll. And so the question that has been asked of some of the technology people is, could that be implemented? And I don't have an answer to that.
Mm-hmm. And I think also the conversations around this is how we can support students the first time they're in a course, so that we're not focusing on when they repeat the course. So how can we support, how can we use early alerts, how can we use co-requisite support? Maybe we have late start classes, certain things like that, so that we can support them the first time that they're in the course and really help them succeed in that first time.
One additional kind of related note on that, because this comes up not just with can we require things, but what happens to students who fail 3 times. And I think, as both Craig and Craig noted, once a student has not done well, once they've, AB 705 creates a lot of structure around what we do as students enter. But once a student has interacted with our institutions, we have more information. And what we do with them after those interactions, if they failed a course, we have much more flexibility with what we're going to do with those courses, as long as we can implement it, right? So those types of, can we implement it with SIS? Those are important questions, but how you might counsel them, what types of things you might open to them, what types of support you might provide them, there's more flexibility with respect to the law. The law speaks primarily to how we place them initially.
And then another question is, will we be mandated to reassess students using AB 705, data that have already assessed using active placer and started their course sequence? And yes, you will.
Yes, yes.
And then what about intermediate algebra for associate degrees not transferring? Also intermediate algebra requirements for prereqs for science courses?
That sounds like a Rutan question.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, one of those I can speak to. One of those is a little bit more complicated. So the prerequisite of intermediate algebra on things like chemistry and biology is a requirement of the UC. And so colleges have typically interpreted that requirement as completion of a course of intermediate algebra or placement in an algebra-based course that's higher because they clearly had the skill of intermediate algebra. It could be that colleges choose to evaluate whether or not the student has completed a course equivalent to intermediate algebra in high school. They may have to change the way their prerequisites work in their enrollment systems, because there is no guarantee that, say, a student completing a statistics class has the algebra skill necessary for the chemistry course. And so the college may choose to require a course that has some algebra background, or that they have to take some corequisite if they have no algebra background to get the algebra necessary to be successful in the science course. Some of that may require some curricular innovation at the college and how to handle it. Although most STEM students who self-select into STEM majors, the intermediate algebra hurdle isn't going to be the biggest one for them. The question about the associate degrees is still an active discussion, and I have no final answer that I can give that is the approved position of the academic senate. So you're going to have to wait on that one for a little bit. We are still having internal discussions.
So I can speak a little bit to that one in deference to the conversations that are still occurring. But having looked at that question at the Bakersfield College curriculum, in particular, among the 140 odd programs that students can select and pursue at Bakersfield College, there was one program which specifically required intermediate algebra. So that program, it's in the program that the students need to take intermediate algebra. So that's one thing to be aware of. That is something that happens, so that can exist. It may exist in your curriculum. The other point here is sort of the language in AB 705, which is sensitive to program study when defining gateway course. So AB 705 is really focused on getting students to and through transfer level, but it also says, or the appropriate math or English for the program of study for the given student. And the intermediate algebra does satisfy the degree requirements for math for a terminal associate's degree, a non-transfer degree. So there is that opening or that possibility. However, when you look at maximizing throughput, what you'll most likely find is that students have a much higher probability of completing statistics, which can then sort of backfill and also satisfy the math requirement for that program, unless the program is specifically written to require in your intermediate algebra. So it may still be, even though you have terminal degrees, which can be satisfied with intermediate algebra, that statistics is still a better option in terms of maximizing probability of completion within 1 year. So it's a little bit definitely nuanced and a lot of, I think, thought and good conversation and dialogue going into how to figure that one out.
Okay, let's do one last question and then we'll close it up. What to do about groups that can't be placed with existing MAP questions, such as don't have junior year completed, 10-year high school, 10 years out of high school international students. So that's where the guided self-placement is going to come into play. And so a lot of colleges are exploring that and finding different ways to look into that. And there's discussion that the academic senate is actually coming out with some guidance on that. I don't know, Craig, if you wanted to add a little bit about that, but that's one avenue.
The Academic Senate has been working on some documents related to guided self-placement. We will be discussing those documents actually this weekend at the Executive Committee meeting, and may have something to share with the field as early as next week.
Oh, great.
That's exciting. You know, on the 10+ years thing, this is a little pet peeve of mine. So just to clarify, what the research found was that high school GPA was a valid predictor that was stronger than the AccuPlacer for as far out as we had good data to see, if you will, and that was 10 years. It didn't say that after 10 years it was no good. It said that after that point we can't say one way or the other. So I wouldn't look at the 10 years as a hard cutoff in that question. So that group, you could still use high school GPA. If you're engaging in a guided self-placement process, certainly makes sense to acquire high school GPA if it's available, even for older students, and to have that factor into the conversation.
And just to kind of, I want to totally underscore what Craig just said. When you look at the predictive utility of high school GPA, it's asymptoting, which means it's kind of leveling off as you get further out, but it's leveling off above the predictive utility of the tests. So even out as far as we can get data for, and when folks like ACT looked at this with Compass, right? Even non-traditional students far afield from high school, these tests, high school GPA is still a better predictor. So I think the difference is after that point, you might play around with, well, do we want to recommend support for the student? If let's say they were a 2.9 in high school and it's now 11 years out. Well, you might move them from the no support required to a recommendation to them to take a concurrent, you know, a co-requisite support, whatever you've developed at your college.
Unless they've been an accountant for the past 10 years.
Sure, right.
You know.
You could take other things into account for those students for sure. But then again, this is where you could work with them with the self-guided placement. But one of the things I don't think you can justify, and this is where you get into real danger with respect to the law, is to suddenly say, well, after 10 years, we're not using GPA at all, and we're going to introduce the possibility that students might need to have prerequisite rather than concurrent support. And that's where you're going to run afoul of the law. All right, so you might move them between categories of support, or how much support that they get, or whether or not you recommend it or require it. But I think you're going to be in a real difficult position with respect to the requirements that the law places on us as colleges if you are moving them into a prerequisite course structure.
So another way to think of it with the time gap issue is that there's no evidence that high school transcripts cease being useful.
That's right.
Yep. Okay, well, I want to thank everyone for joining us today on this webinar, and thank you to my co-presenters. And then also up above on the screen, all of our webinars are archived on the MAP webpage, as well as our joint webinars with the ESL group, California ESL group. And then we have upcoming webinars for MAP and ED results that are listed here. Hopefully you can join those webinars. And we look forward to answering any of your questions that you may have. If we haven't answered them here, our email addresses are at the beginning of this webinar and also on the MAP page. And just again, thanks for all your work moving forward with AB 705. Everyone have a fantastic rest of your day.